What would you do if Jimmy Hoffa walked into your wedding ceremony in Detroit and stopped everything on May the 18th, 1971? That's exactly what happened to two strangers. What he did next wasn't just unexpected, it became the most magical moment in the history of the Teamsters Union building. And 50 years later, their grandson revealed why that one moment changed 3 generations of their family forever. It was a Tuesday evening in Detroit, and the city was buzzing with its usual energy. Factories were changing shifts. Bars were filling up with workers, and at the Teamsters Union building, Jimmy Hoffa had just finished an important meeting. He was at the peak of his career, even though he'd had some troubles with the government in recent years. As union president, he influenced the lives of millions of workers, and that night was no different. But what nobody knew was that in the small St. Josaphat church, right next to the building, something much more intimate was taking place. A young couple, Thomas and Catherine Murphy, were about to get married. They weren't wealthy. They weren't famous. They were just 2 kids in love who had saved every penny they had to afford a simple ceremony in Detroit. Thomas was 24 years old, a factory worker from Ohio. Catherine was 22, a teacher with dreams bigger than her bank account. They had $300 to their name, and they'd spent $150 of it just to rent the church for 1 hour. There was no band, no singer, no fancy decorations. Just a small room with 10 wooden chairs, a simple altar, and a priest who had already performed 6 weddings that day. Catherine's sister Mary had driven 12 hours from Ohio to be there. Thomas had no family present. His parents had passed away years earlier, and his older brother was stationed overseas in the military. This wedding was supposed to be quiet, simple, and quick. Get married, take a few photos, and head back to their motel room. That was the plan. Jimmy Hoffa had finished his meeting and was about to leave the building. Usually at this hour, he would relax in his office or have dinner with his team. But that night, Jimmy was restless. He decided to walk around the building, something he rarely did. He liked observing people when they didn't know he was watching. It reminded him of his early days before the fame, when he was just Jimmy Hoffa from Brazil, Indiana. As Jimmy walked past the front of the building, he noticed something unusual. Near the church steps, he saw a young woman in a simple white dress. She was crying. Not the happy tears you see at weddings, but the kind of tears that come from disappointment. Standing next to her was a young man in an ill-fitting suit that was clearly borrowed. He was trying to comfort her, but he looked just as devastated. Jimmy stopped. He watched them for a moment. The woman wiped her eyes with a crumpled tissue. The man pulled her close and whispered something in her ear. Then Jimmy heard it. Just a few words, but they hit him like a punch to the chest. I'm sorry, Tommy. I know you wanted to give me more. I know you wanted music and dancing and everything special, but this is enough. You're enough. That's when Jimmy Hoffa made a decision that would change 4 lives forever. He walked directly up to the couple. Thomas and Catherine looked up, startled. For a moment, they didn't recognize him. They were too consumed by their own emotions. But when Jimmy spoke, his voice was unmistakable. Excuse me, folks. I couldn't help but notice you two look like you're heading somewhere important. Catherine's eyes went wide. She grabbed Thomas's arm. Oh my God, Tommy, that's Jimmy Hoffa. Thomas stammered. Mr. Hoffa, we're sorry if we're in the way. Jimmy smiled that famous, confident smile of his. You're not in the way at all, pal. In fact, I think I'm the one who's in the way. Am I correct in assuming you two are about to get hitched? Catherine nodded, still in shock. Yes, sir, in about 15 minutes, inside that church. Jimmy looked at her dress, then at Thomas's suit, then at Mary standing awkwardly behind them, holding a small bouquet of daisies that looked like they'd been bought at a gas station. And let me guess, Jimmy said, his voice gentle. You're doing this without all the fancy stuff? No band, no singer, just you two and love? Thomas felt embarrassed. We don't have much money, Mr. Hoffa, but we have each other. That's what matters. Jimmy put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. You know what, kid? You're absolutely right. That is what matters. But here's the thing. He paused, looking between the two of them. I come from nothing. I know what it's like to want to give someone you love the world, but only have pocket change to offer. And I also know that sometimes when you least expect it, a little magic shows up. Catherine was crying again. But this time, they were different tears. Mr. Hoffa, are you saying... I'm saying, Jimmy interrupted, that I've got about 90 minutes ahead of me and I can't think of a better way to spend them than making sure you two have a wedding you'll never forget. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to speak at your ceremony and give you a gift. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas couldn't speak. Catherine covered her mouth with both hands. Mary dropped the bouquet. You want to speak at our wedding? Thomas finally managed to say. I don't want to, Jimmy said with a wink. I need to. Trust me on this. Now come on. We've got a church waiting and I've got a speech in my heart. What happened next became the stuff of legend around the Teamsters building. Jimmy Hoffa, one of the most powerful men in the world, walked into that small church. The priest nearly had a heart attack. Jimmy didn't ask permission. He didn't make a big announcement. He simply walked to the front of the room, positioned himself near the altar, and nodded to Thomas and Catherine. All right, let's get you two married. The ceremony began. The priest stumbled through his lines, clearly nervous with Jimmy Hoffa standing 3 feet away from him. Thomas held Catherine's hands, both of them trembling. Mary sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, unable to believe what was happening. And then came the moment that would be remembered for 5 decades, when the priest said, "You may kiss the bride." Jimmy Hoffa began to speak. He talked about union membership, workers' rights, the power of solidarity. But he didn't use political jargon. He spoke in warm, genuine words about love, commitment, the meaning of standing together. The greatest power I've ever seen, he said, his voice full of emotion, is when 2 people stand side by side and say, together we can overcome anything. No boss, no government, no hardship can break that bond. Catherine buried her face in Thomas's chest and sobbed. Thomas held her tight, his own eyes wet with tears. Mary was openly weeping. Even the priest had to wipe his eyes. When Jimmy finished his speech, he walked over to the newlyweds and shook Thomas's hand. Congratulations, Mr. Murphy. You take care of this lady. She's a gem. Then he turned to Catherine and kissed her hand. And you, Mrs. Murphy, you've got yourself a good man. I can tell you two are going to be very happy. Catherine found her voice. Mr. Hoffa, I don't know how to thank you. Jimmy smiled. You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. Just love each other. That's all the thanks I need. Oh, and one more thing. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He handed it to Thomas. Go have a nice dinner tonight, somewhere fancy. On me. Thomas tried to refuse. Mr. Hoffa, we can't. Yes, you can, Jimmy said firmly but kindly. And you will. Now go enjoy your wedding night, and congratulations again. Jimmy Hoffa walked out of that church as quietly as he had entered. He didn't tell his team anything. He didn't tell the press. He didn't use it for publicity. He just did it because it felt like the right thing to do. That night, Thomas and Catherine Murphy left Detroit walking on air. They used the $100 to have dinner at one of the city's finest restaurants, a place they never could have afforded on their own. They ordered champagne, steak, and dessert. They talked about what had just happened, replaying every moment, every word, every feeling. Do you think anyone will believe us? Catherine asked. Thomas laughed. Probably not, but I don't care. We know what happened. That's all that matters. But here's the incredible part of this story. The part that nobody knew until 50 years later. Jimmy Hoffa's act of kindness didn't just give them a beautiful memory. It changed the entire trajectory of their lives. That night, sitting in that fancy restaurant, Thomas and Catherine made a promise to each other. They promised that they would never forget what Jimmy Hoffa had done for them. And they promised that whenever they had the chance, they would do the same kind of thing for someone else. They would look for people who needed a little magic in their lives, and they would provide it. No questions asked. Over the next 5 decades, Thomas and Catherine Murphy became known in their community in Ohio as the couple who helped everyone. They paid for strangers' groceries. They helped young couples with wedding expenses. They donated to every charity that came their way. They opened their home to people who needed a place to stay. They lived modestly, but they gave generously. Their children grew up watching this behavior and adopted it themselves. Their grandchildren learned the same values. The ripple effect of what Jimmy Hoffa did in that church on May the 18th, 1971, spread across 3 generations. But Thomas and Catherine never told anyone the full story. Not their children, not their friends, not even their priest. They kept Jimmy Hoffa's kindness as their own private treasure, something sacred between the two of them, until 2022. On May 18th, 2022, exactly 50 years after their wedding, Thomas and Catherine's family threw them a huge anniversary party. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren all gathered at a banquet hall in Ohio. It was a beautiful celebration of a marriage that had lasted half a century. During the party, their grandson Michael stood up to give a speech. He talked about his grandparents' generosity, their kindness, their unwavering love for each other and for everyone around them. And then he said something that made the entire room go silent. I never understood where Grandma and Grandpa learned to be so giving. They always just said it was the right thing to do. But last month, while helping Grandma clean out some old boxes, I found a photograph. It was from their wedding day. And on the back of that photograph were 5 words that I didn't understand. The day Jimmy saved us. Michael pulled out the photograph and held it up. It was a blurry amateur shot taken by Mary with a cheap camera. But there, clear as day, was Jimmy Hoffa standing next to Thomas and Catherine in that small church. So I asked Grandma about it, Michael continued, his voice shaking, and she told me a story I'll never forget. Catherine stood up, tears already streaming down her face. Thomas, now 74 years old and using a cane, stood beside her, and for the first time in 50 years, they told the complete story of what Jimmy Hoffa had done for them. The room was speechless. Some people cried, some people laughed in disbelief, but everyone understood finally why Thomas and Catherine had spent their entire lives giving to others. Jimmy Hoffa didn't just speak at our wedding, Thomas said, his voice still strong despite his age. He taught us what it means to be truly generous. He didn't do it for publicity. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he saw two kids who needed a little magic, and he had the power to provide it. That lesson shaped everything we became. Catherine added, every time we helped someone over the years, every time we gave when we didn't have much to give, we thought about that night. We thought about Jimmy standing in that church, speaking with all his heart for an audience of 3. That's real love. That's real generosity. And that's what we wanted our lives to represent. The story of Jimmy Hoffa and the Murphy wedding went viral. News outlets picked it up. Entertainment historians researched it. Former Teamsters employees came forward with their own memories of that night. One former security guard, now 89 years old, said, I remember Jimmy coming back from somewhere that night. He had this look on his face like he'd just done something wonderful. He was humming something to himself. I asked him if he was okay, and he just smiled and said, I just remembered why I got into this business. I never knew what he meant until I read this story. Jimmy Hoffa never publicized what he did that night. He never mentioned it in interviews. He never used it to boost his image. He simply did it because it was the right thing to do. And that, perhaps, more than anything else he ever did, any fight he ever fought, is the real legacy of Jimmy Hoffa. Today, the church where Jimmy Hoffa spoke for Thomas and Catherine Murphy still stands. But the impact of what happened in that small room on May 18th, 1971 lives on in 3 generations of the Murphy family and the countless people they've helped over the years, and in everyone who hears this story and decides to do something kind for a stranger. Because that's what Jimmy Hoffa taught us that night. Solidarity isn't just about slogans. Real power comes from seeing someone in need and taking action. And sometimes when we're lucky, somebody loves everybody.